Hey, welcome back, listening audience and viewing audience. If you're watching us live on the webs, we are Mike and Jake, and we are with Walk the Talk America. This is the Guns and Mental Health Podcast, and today we are joined by Chloe Carmichael, PhD. drchloe.com is where you can find her. She's written a really cool new book that I cannot recommend highly enough to everyone, and she's joining us from the free state of Florida. How are you, Chloe?
I'm really well, thank you. It's nice to be back with you. And Michael, thanks for holding up the book. That's very kind of you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Nice to see you.
You too.
Yeah, the book is called Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety, and it was recently dropped, what, a year ago? Something like that? 2 years ago?
Actually 20, let's see, they did the hardback in 21, I think, and then the paperback in
Oh,
22.
oh wow. Okay. So three. Anyway, some of us were a little later to the game than others, but you said it's nice to be back. And that was a reference to your interview on Noggin Notes, which is hopefully we do almost an identical show here because the content was so good that I want our different audience here at Guns and Mental Health to hear what you have to say. But in between, I know you've done some digging on your own to find out what this firearms and mental health nexus actually constitutes. So without further delay, I will step aside and let you introduce yourself a little bit further and tell everybody who you are, where you come from, and all that stuff, and what you do for a living. And we'll just roll from there.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I found Jake through, I can't even remember who, oh yeah, that he's a comedian named Awaken with JP, and
Yeah,
he was
JP series.
promoting this really interesting series on guns because JP himself had been through kind of a personal journey about freedom and guns and all kinds of things. And I was just watching the interviews in this documentary and I found them very interesting. And so that's how I found Jake. I'm a clinical psychologist, as Jake mentioned, and I do live in the free state of Florida now, but that is after 20 years in New York City, where I loved when I was 8 years old. I told everybody I was going to live in New York and be on television. And so those things, came true for me. I was living a great life as a clinical psychologist on TV, as a psychologist, expert in New York. And it was a great life with my husband and our son. But dun dun dun, COVID, they wanted to mask my then 3-year-old. And up until that point, I had sort of towed the line as far as, the media because I was enjoying my press and all those things. And so I would never say anything that wasn't true in the media, but I would also never say anything that I knew was going to ruffle their feathers. And that was it for me. They wanted to mask my 3-year-old. And there were no psychologists talking about why we shouldn't be masking 3-year-olds. In fact, it would really upset me the most when they would say, well, there's no study showing that there's any problems with that, none whatsoever. And they would fail to say the reason is because no study has ever been done, because you could never get approval for such a study, because the very idea of experimenting on kids by covering their faces for long periods of time like that, is it rings the abuse alarm enough that you wouldn't even do a study like that. So anyway, I wrote an article about the, harms, I believe, of, masking children and sent it to some colleagues to say, hey, am I like missing something here? Because why are no other psychologists talking about this? Am I just, missing something? And they read the article and they said, no, this is all correct, but you shouldn't publish it because it could stop people from masking their kids. And that was when I really started to feel like I was in the twilight zone. So I up and moved to Florida where my son could show his face. I published the article. I started just feeling amazing. And then I started writing and publishing about the mental health benefits of free speech. My husband and I did get some guns when we moved to Florida. I only know how to use them in a very rudimentary way. It's not really my thing. My husband's more into that, which I think is great. I support that. But it's just not my personal thing, though. I would like to get better at it. So I hope that gives you the basics.
That was an
Yeah,
awesome overview.
yeah. What? That's the thing. You experience something that I think a lot of gun owners experience when people propose laws and legislation, right? And gun owners have a problem sometimes, like voicing. It's like, we're not going to just do something stupid just to feel good. Right. We're not going to just start, like in your case, it's like masking 3-year-olds, right? And in our case, it's like, okay, banning ARs. That's not going to stop one less firearm death. That makes no sense. So I can totally appreciate where you're coming from. And it's kind of cool that you can kind of make the, draw a parallel to it, to gun culture.
I want to jump in and put a little more emphasis on what you did with the research paper, because, and I don't know if I ever came across it when I was in the midst of this, but when I'd had a belly full of it in late 21, I want to say, turned the corner at, so 21 into 22, there was still, no, maybe it was 21. Yeah, it was, I don't even know. It was all blur now, but I was hell bent to take the mask off my kids. It was 21 because they'd started the school year in 20 with them on their face. And I looked through our governor's directive and found that there was latitude granted to school administrators and school leaders to be able to leapfrog that directive to mask the children if they had a medical necessity. Well, what happened in our local school district was the school board of trustees revoked that autonomy from the school leaders to even make that call. So I had several friends who were trying very hard to get their fill in the blank diagnostic children with all sorts of disabilities to remove the masks, and it was a hard no from the school district. Well, fortunately, my kids went to a charter school that at the time I happened to chair the board of, and I was like, this is nuts. So our school leader was savvy enough to say, I'll accept the letters. So what I did is I took an angle that said, this is so ubiquitous to children's health that you don't need to have an illness of any kind to leapfrog the restriction. So I started writing mask exemption letters under the authority I held in statute as what they would refer to as a medical professional, because I do fall under that chapter of Nevada revised statutes. And I ended up writing like 161 or 162 of them. And it was really scary because I thought for sure that I was going to be hauled in front of my licensing board and have to defend myself for quote unquote practicing out of scope or some nonsense. But I think I articulated it well enough that if that came, I was going to be fine. But it was another matter trying to convince the parents. They were like, "Are you sure we're not going to get in trouble for this?" The pressure was palpable, and where I'm going with this is not to do a humble brag on myself and how I fought for children, but to say, had you and I met back then, maybe we do push back because we galvanize voices that were self-censoring. And you and I have a commonality with the Open Therapy Institute and what Andrew Hartz is doing to fight that self-censorship. Because when people are isolated, and the gun community does this for sure, when people are isolated, we don't share common ideas, and then it seems like we're the baddies, right? When the narrative is controlled and people aren't allowed to talk to each other, it can be very, very destructive. So I'm thankful that you did that. I applaud you for having the guts to move. That's very challenging. But that's why we have these podcasts. This is to let people know that they can listen in the comfort of their own homes and workspaces privately and go, oh, okay, there's more people out there that share my beliefs than I realized. I should probably talk to them so that we don't get isolated and people don't perpetrate further harm on themselves or others.
That's so true. Yeah, I mean, I wish that we had known each other because, again, even with all of my training, was second guessing myself and saying, is there something here I'm missing? Even though, there's so many just obviously good reasons why we shouldn't be masking children. And, I had shown it to all of my colleagues, and even it was like I was talking to zombies. Like they were just
Yep.
like, no, everything is correct, but should not share because could discourage masking children. And I'm just like, what? Even though the whole article was about why we should not be masking children,
Yeah.
And thankfully, as you said, Jake, that, and Michael, I don't know your background as much, but I'm very thankful for our training, because whether it be about this issue or many other issues where the mental health field is messing with, I think, kids and parents and families, we have some kind of a basis on which we can answer back. And we have some training and some knowledge. Like even I was saying before we came on that I was looking at some of these quote studies about gun ownership and how it's, quote, bad for kids and whatnot. And with my training of knowing how to look at a study critically, I can say, well, hey, this study may be flawed for X, Y, and Z reasons, and maybe it was written with an agenda in mind. But parents who don't have that training, it would be like me trying to talk back to my plumber about how my house should be plumbed. I don't know. I'm just gonna, take his recommendation. And then just one more point, Jake, on the subject that you mentioned of the importance of us just being able to talk freely like we are here. I mentioned I wrote about the mental health benefits of free speech. And I also wrote about groupthink and how I specifically wrote about how I was so thankful that Elon Musk had bought Twitter because, as people probably know, groupthink is when you get a sense of social consensus that's so strong about an issue. And interestingly enough, the conditions for groupthink also tend to be where the issue is framed as being particularly moral and as if there's an expert opinion, and in which self-censorship starts to occur. And that's when, groupthink occurs. And, the Bay of Pigs was the example that actually literally led to the term groupthink, being coined, because people just start acting nonsensically following, the group of the machine. And so, I mean, again, I was all alone prior to that. Nobody else that I knew of was saying anything about it. And when I did tweet it, Jack Posobiec and Dr. Jay Bhattacharya and many others retweeted it. And I can't tell you how many parents reached out to me to just say, thank you for, because they had no way to answer back. You know what I mean? Like they had their normal common sense instincts. But when some, quote, expert is telling you, it reminds me, frankly, of the trans thing, where they're like, would you rather have a dead daughter or a living son? And they terrify the parents, ironically, oftentimes terrify them into harming their children. So I'm so glad that we can just have an open dialogue. It's insane to me that we have to be so thankful for, I mean, we should have always been thankful for free speech, but only recently, I think, has it come under attack like this to the point where we actually realize how special it is.
Yeah, this conversation's taken a different turn than we advertised. We are definitely going to get the anxiety and cover your book, but this all feeds in, right? So when you intentionally or unintentionally through groupthink isolate people into believing they're the only ones with a certain position and that they're not allowed to express that position, that can absolutely lead to mental illness. Why don't we go that direction and talk about what occurs when people believe that they're so alone that they can't reach out to anybody else? And that speaks directly to the heart of what our organization does, which is tries to foster a conversation about being mentally well so that we don't suffer in silence and then wind up taking our own lives.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think that there's a similar issue of groupthink actually around the subject of mental wellness, mental illness, and mental wellness. So, I mean, for a long time, mental illness was stigmatized so much that we really needed a movement to say, hey, it's okay to talk about it. But now I think it's gone to the point, I think, because big pharma and other, corporate reasons have wanted to medicalize and monetize every human emotion to the point where, again, with my book, Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety, the idea there is that anxiety is a normal human emotion. We're supposed to have it. If you didn't have it, actually, there would be something wrong with you then. And the healthy function of it, again, is to stimulate a person to say, okay, well, what are the constructive, healthy actions I should be taking right now? And it's very interesting to me that big pharma and big medicine, they seem like they would much rather, medicate us, drug us, make us feel like it's more brave and stunning to get online and talk about how sick we are with our anxiety, as opposed to even just normalizing it and saying, yeah, I was really anxious about being overweight, so I decided to go to the gym. They'd much rather give you a lifelong, pill prescription about your anxiety.
I think Mike's having some camera issues. I'm not sure what's going on down there in Vegas.
I know, he's playing peekaboo with us.
Peekaboo. I see you. I don't see you anymore. But yeah, the listening audience who's on the video is like, "What are you talking about?" Um, and now his audio's off. He's all wrecked. He's on the wrong internet. He's using
All
his
right, I'm
Hewlett
back. I'm
Packard
back. I'm
from
here. I could
2008.
hear you the whole time. I love what you're saying. Keep going. All right.
Well, okay, so for clinicians listening to this, we do this to ourselves in our field, and I'll use one example. We get threatened with practicing out of scope for daring to suggest that medication may need to be altered. Totally true. Okay, I don't have a medical degree. Certainly, it's not in psychiatry because that requires a fellowship. But the idea is that if we have a patient in front of us who's really suffering and they've been on medicine for some time and it doesn't seem to be getting better, I believe it's absolutely our job to question it. And I'm not saying we need to make a recommendation for altering it, but we need to tell them, hey, go back to your doctor because this does not appear to me to be working. And that's a scary step for a lot of students and interns, especially, simply to ask that question, because we've been so indoctrinated to believe that there's a hierarchy to degrees and licenses that we are not allowed to question that. And to do so is tantamount to heresy. So not only could we get accused of practicing out of scope, but people will possibly not come back to us because we're, stepping out of line with the consensus, if you will. And I'm glad you mentioned Jay, because I was just on his podcast yesterday. I mean, I cannot tell you how humbled I was to do that. And we were speaking about WTTA and guns and mental health stuff, but his podcast is called The Illusion of Consensus. And it really is an illusion. Real science, real psychotherapy challenges everything all the time to make sure that the person is acting with intentionality to make good decisions that benefit themselves, so that they live happy, healthy lives. And so I come off sounding like a weirdo sometimes, saying I'm trying to work myself out of a job because I dare take the position that people can heal themselves through their own communities and families. But that's exactly what you're talking about. Like, you wrote a book that's a true self-help book, but you've normalized the conversation. Say, hey, we need this understanding of anxiety because it motivates us and prepares us to do things that we otherwise might get overwhelmed by. In a way, it actually embraces something that's been branded as bad, almost the way that, like, I don't know, religious people say that you shouldn't be angry. It's like, no, anger is a good thing. You want anger. We got to figure out why you're angry, but don't just try to pretend you're not angry, because that carves out a very healthy part of you that you'll need from time to time.
Yeah, I would just jump in there about religious, what you mentioned. You said religious people say you shouldn't be angry. I'm a religious person, and I don't say that you shouldn't be angry. There's actually many examples in the Bible of righteous anger. So people who, and the healthy function of anger is actually to stimulate boundary setting and to gain the vigor to address injustices. So a person who says that religious people, if there are religious people who say that you shouldn't be angry, I would attribute that honestly more to something maybe that they're misunderstanding about their religion, at least as far as Christianity goes, because my references with Christianity within the Bible, I mean, Jesus flipped tables in the temple because he was angry that they were selling things and that there was commerce there, and that he felt like they were defiling the temple, and he became angry and flipped tables. I just want to say, people, you can be religious and you can be angry, and they don't have to be out of sync with each other necessarily.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. And that speaks to the motivational power of anger, is to motivate to make change.
Yes.
Of course they killed him for it, but
yeah, they literally
if I go
crucified
that
him,
way,
right? But then again, he actually also literally signed up for it. Thank
Yeah.
God, so to speak.
Yeah, truly, thank God. So let's dive in a little bit to this anxiety thing. I'll clear the runway here, and you can take off.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would, as far as with anxiety, you mean you want me to share more about that?
You are the guest. Yes, we would like to hear more from you, not from me.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I'm happy to share that anxiety totally has a healthy function. I've noticed that a lot of times when people have anxiety, their first thought, like, they would come to my office, very intelligent, driven people, and they would say, "Oh my goodness, I'm anxious," as if this means there's something wrong with them. Like, I found a boil, on my body or something. Like, I'm anxious. And that ironically would then create more anxiety because they were sensing that there was something wrong with them. And so I would find that they would, either become more anxious about that, or they would immediately assume that the best thing to do was to do some breathing exercises and think of a beach and learn how to just calm down. Very similar actually to the way that when anger management patients come to my office, sometimes they say, I want to learn how to not be angry. I want to learn how to just let it go. And in both cases, the anxious person and the angry person, what I actually try to teach them to do is learn how to detect the anxiety and the anger at lower levels and to not ignore it, but learn what are some constructive things that this could be stimulating me to do. The classic example is like, oh, gee, I'm anxious because I have a big test tomorrow. Well, closing your eyes and thinking of a beach isn't going to help you with that, right? Instead, what we would, and there's 9 techniques in my book, I will say, and it's been translated now into many languages, which is awesome. And for those of you that are clinicians, there's actually a version of my program now that you can get continuing education credit for, depending on your state and your licensure. So if you go to makeachange.us, it'll take you to my website. And from there, you can navigate, or you can ask me on social media, because I really want to empower more clinicians to be able to just teach people these 9 techniques. And there's plenty more than that. It's just 9 that I have in my book to teach people how to actually identify a source of anxiety, and depending on the details of that source, select one of these techniques and use it constructively. And ironically, that is how we soothe and settle anxiety. That's how people oftentimes just actually do come to feel better. Same with the anger. I say we want to learn how for you to address what's making you angry when you're just a little bit irritable, because they often have a good reason for being angry, but they wait till they're so boiling mad that they flip out, and then they become the bad guy in the situation when they actually had a legitimate complaint in the first place. So we try to learn how to actually tune into the anger earlier, and then learn how to act upon it in a constructive, assertive, but controlled manner.
I thought myself, yeah, Mike's reaching. There we go.
Yeah, I was going to say, are you familiar with the term lead therapy? Like basically people shooting to relieve anxiety?
No, I can't say I am, but that's very interesting.
Yeah, a lot of people do it just because it's when you're shooting, you have to stay focused. You have to kind of block out everything that's going on in your world. Obviously, you can't make a mistake, right? Like safety is a real thing out there, but it is a thing. But when you're talking about all that, it kind of reminds me of all the people that come to us and say like, the range is my form of therapy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really cool. That is amazing. Yeah, I could totally see that happening. I mean, similar things happen, say, with rock climbing or whatever, just hobbies that require 100% focus and concentration. It just allows you to leave all the noise behind for a few minutes. That's really cool.
You want to walk us through your book without giving the whole thing away and tell us what those 9 techniques are? And then I do want to hear about some of that research that you pulled that may be, shall we say, less than robust.
Sure, sure. Yeah. So it kind of works like a cookbook. So there's 9 techniques in it, and you can do them in any order that you want, except for the first one. The first one is a mindfulness exercise, but I have to say, before everybody tunes out and says, oh, mindfulness, I can read about that in Cosmopolitan magazine. I just want to say what I'm doing as a psychologist with it is different. Um, I was a yoga teacher before I was a psychologist decades ago. And I think that the whole mindfulness word has become so watered down. The term I prefer to really say is metacognition, the ability to be thinking about your thoughts. So if you go into a networking event and you're feeling nervous, to be able to not only have the self-awareness to recognize that you're feeling nervous, but to have the metacognition to say, well, why am I? What is the context? Why am I feeling nervous? Is it because I didn't eat very much today and I'm feeling really spacey and I feel like I have to pump myself up and it's hard? Or is it because I'm like the least educated person in this room and I have a fear of everyone's going to like think less of me? Or is it because I actually need a job right now and I hate asking for things? But so the more metacognition, the more we can study the problem, the better equipped we'll be to choose the right tool to solve it. So once you do the first essential technique, which is, again, more metacognition, and it teaches people how to do that, how to study what's going on with them in the first place. Then there are 8 other techniques, and I'll just give you, say, 2 examples. I break the techniques down into what I call the leaning in techniques, which is where we say, okay, here's the anxiety. It's stimulating me to do something, and I'm going to do it. So one of those techniques is called the to-do list with emotions. So we take a to-do list. Everybody's heard of that. We look at the emotions that go with the thing that's on our list. So again, suppose that it's, going to a networking event and the emotion is anxious because I always get tongue-tied when I'm meeting new people. Then we layer in a self-care plan. So now we're really leaning into the anxiety. We're saying, what is the constructive behavior that this anxiety is stimulating me to do? It's stimulating me to, say, make a list of 5 small talk topics that I can have at the ready at my mental fingertips before I go to this. So, I'll make sure that I can talk about my involvement with this organization, something interesting from my professional life, something interesting that I did this summer, and maybe 1 or 2 other things, so that when I'm navigating that room, I'm not just sitting there drawing a complete blank. So that's an example, again, of what I call the leaning in techniques, where the anxiety is stimulating you to do something constructive about the source of the anxiety. Now, there are also what I call pivoting away techniques. And that's when, suppose the networking event is over, you did great, you did your follow-ups, everything else, but your body's still just like a little bit razzed, like just from all the adrenaline and the cortisol, and you're just like on, but there's no target for it anymore from that networking event. Then you can do a pivot away technique. And an example of that from my book, Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety. An example is what I call the mental shortlist technique. And what we do there is we come up with 5 things that would be more useful targets for this mental energy that we have now that just replaying and rerunning, reliving that networking event is kind of a dead end mental path for us because it's over and we did all the follow-up we should do. We could say, okay, well, what are 5 things that I could be putting my energy into? Like, is there a work project I'm supposed to be getting on top of? Could I get a jump on my birthday and holiday shopping lists? Should I think about cleaning my house? Like, what if I'm feeling mentally energetic, rather than pursue this dead end topic, which is what psychologists think of as ruminating, where could I redirect that energy? But I always make sure to tell people you only have Dr. Chloe's permission to use the mental shortlist technique and the other pivot away techniques, like, even the old bliss out and think of a beach visualization type thing. It only makes sense to do that when you really have examined the anxiety and you know that there's no constructive action that anxiety is actually stimulating you to take about the source of the anxiety.
Very good. It's so great having a guest who just like goes.
Well, I was a professor at one
I
point too,
I
so
know it's like
maybe I'm lecturing a little bit. Sorry
no,
about
no, no.
that.
It's great because like I'm just focused and like repeating this stuff in my head. And like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh wait, I need to speak. I need to
Well,
jump in.
I would encourage people too, like you don't have to be a clinician to take the video training. It's a 3-hour training in these techniques. And you there's a price for clinicians that want to get continuing education credit because it's a whole extra fee that I don't even control. And then there's just a fee for if you just as a consumer want to take it, because some people love to read books. But some people, they want to watch me on video talk through it and explain it. And so that's also just available on video for people if they want to do that too.
What do you think? what do you think led to the overuse of anxiety in our broad culture that leads people to roll their eyes when they hear it?
Well, again, I think it's a few things that medicalization and monetization. So, there's big pharma, big medicine, even actually big education that like makes a lot of money by these, support staff and extra time for tests. And then it allows people to get admitted to schools and pay tuition that they wouldn't otherwise be in because they have documented test anxiety or, whatever the case may be. So I think that there's a lot of dollars behind trying to give everybody a diagnosis, for one thing. Um, I think that there's also, again, just there, we've really stepped away from religiosity and spirituality as a society, and people don't have as much of a sense of identity. The idea of two parents in the home, one of whom is prioritizing homemaking is really is falling away a lot. I'm very blessed that I was able to largely step away from my work. Honestly, I work about 10 hours a week right now because I'm devoting my time and energy to being a wife and mother, primarily, mother. Like I could totally work and be a wife, but being a mother is a totally different thing. And being with my son, helping him to regulate his emotions and giving him that sense of identity and who he is and being involved with our church, those things are all helping him, you know, to be able to not have to identify with a mental health disorder as a way to organize and understand his emotions. I mean, I was actually on a show recently, and this I was there with another psychologist, and the host asked us both a similar question to what you said. Um, and this psychologist, I had to restrain myself. I didn't want to be impolite, but I was shocked by what he said. He said, well, if kids want to go to see a therapist, kind of whether they need it or not, so what? I mean, parents are so busy these days. The kids just need somewhere that they can go to talk. And I was like, oh my goodness, the answer is not to make therapists more available. The answer is to empower parents, including women. I know for myself as a woman, I was really encouraged to, quote, be somebody, to do more. The idea, if I had said from the start, it was almost like a dirty secret. I had to come out of the closet and say, even honestly, almost confessing to my husband, that I wanted to, be more of a homemaker. And I think when our society doesn't respect and empower that, um, I think the idea that it's going to have an impact on kids and that they're going to, have less of a rock and a stability and less time with the people who love them and created them, teaching them who they are. Well, then it's no surprise that they end up frazzled.
Well, not only endorses it and supports it, but I think I would contend that we're actually eroding it. I think society and culture are actually eroding that. And one of the things I'm really changing my mind about in the last few months is the idea of school-based services. I Zephyr Wellness pioneered school-based mental health services in Northern Nevada some years ago. Nobody was doing it. There was a few attempts made, but really we launched it, and we did it for an entire school district in one case. And that's because that school district is very rural and has nothing in the community. But for communities of 500,000 people, like the greater Reno-Sparks area, I don't know that that's necessary. And I think what we do is we create that institutional structure, like you alluded to before, where the jobs of the people depend on diagnosing the children in the school so that they sustain the employment of the professionals. Like, how many kids really need a speech therapist on site? It's certainly not as many as I think there are speech therapists on site, but mental health is the same way. And I think as we continue to outsource parenting to schools and school staff, it's very much like outsourcing public problems to police officers. I'll never forget, we had Brandon Casanelli on at some point years ago. He's a police officer and a marriage and family therapist intern at the time. He's almost fully licensed now, but he said, picture the belt we wear, right? The belt back in the day used to be handcuffs, baton, maybe a firearm, and a radio. And now look at police and what they carry. It's like They got a camera on the vest. They got multiple handcuffs. They got rubber gloves. They got a taser on the leg. They've got all these trinkets. But then, in addition to that, they're asked to do different roles. Oh, by the way, you're now supposed to be a social worker. Oh, by the way, you're now supposed to be a juvenile probation officer in case that you see a kid. Right? It's like let them just enforce the law. And I think we're doing that with school settings too. And almost unconsciously, the parents are like, yeah, whatever, the school will take care of it. And that's
Oh, it's
really, really
true.
bad.
I agree, and it's that expert class again. I mean, I may have shared this with you on our previous show, but you said it's okay if there's some overlap. So just another example of, big education and that overlap with big mental health. And thank goodness that I felt like I could answer back, but I don't think other parents would because they just don't have the training. So when my son, who's in second grade now and he's doing really well, when he was in kindergarten, the teacher, was in touch with me because, he was just kind of constantly, busy scooting around, not staying in place on the rug during story time. And so, she had suggested that we call in an occupational therapist to observe him. And hey, I'm open, so I said, yeah, sure, go ahead, do that. And so the occupational therapist observed him for one day and said that she believed that he has a sensory motor disorder and that he should be given an accommodation to lie down on his stomach. And I said, no, no. I said, my son is just a rule pusher. I said, if you give him an accommodation to lie on his stomach, he's just going to find some other, thing to do. And she said, well, let me do some testing with him and I'll show you what, So I said, okay. So I was able, of course, as a parent to observe the testing. I'm a PhD. She's a master's level. If we were in a clinic setting, I would be supervising her. And I was able to observe because I know how to do these tests. I've been trained in them myself. I observed her making errors in her administration of the testing protocol. And so then when she tried to talk to me about, well, gee, the results show X, Y, and Z, I said, really, but you didn't do A, B, or C, and you were supposed to do that, right? Um, and so that like really rattled her. I mean, and so then look, I'm happy to do whatever's best for my son. I don't want him disrupting the class on the story time rug. I said, let me just talk to him. And so I pulled him aside and I told him exactly what was going to happen at home if I got any more reports about any rug time problems. And you know what? We never had any more rug time problems. And it didn't require any therapy and it didn't require any medication. And, to your point earlier, Jake, about that you felt sometimes, afraid, I think maybe was the word you used, to talk to patients about, the medications that they are on. As a clinical psychologist, I actually am uniquely legally empowered to do that. Under Medicaid, I'm actually rated as a physician. Even though I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm a clinical psychologist. They rate us as uniquely able to do that because we have, like many years in training and things about that. And so I've been able to have those conversations with clients and say to them, I'm happy to refer you to a psychiatrist if you want, but I would recommend that before we do that, you commit to exercising 3 times a week, getting a massage every other week, and committing to put your phone in a different room and 0 social media for 2 weeks. And then we decide, if you really need to be on medication. And of course, it's ultimately up to the patient, but me being empowered to say that to patients, I think is an important thing. And again, I can't help but wonder because I have so little trust in big pharma and big medicine and big mental health. There's been this mushrooming of all like more and more and more and more different types of people that are able to administer mental health therapy sessions. But it's an interesting point you make that none of them, except for the clinical psychologist, which is a very small portion, are really able to have deep and meaningful discussions about medication in the particular way about that a clinical psychologist is. And I almost can't help but wonder if that's by design, you know what I mean, on some level, because it benefits big pharma to have people scared to to challenge and discuss in a meaningful way a person's medication protocol.
Do you find though too that on the flip side of it, right? Like how many people take their medication and properly monitor themselves, right? Like, so I can come to you, tell you I have problems and I want to be put on some SSRI or anything like that, you know, and then I'm going out to the bar every weekend, still getting hammered. You know what I mean? Like, I think that it's kind of a combination of both, right? Like people are too quick to just give it. And then on the other side, I think a lot of people don't have a plan for it. Cause I mean, there's a lot of people that take medication and, you know, feel good, and medication in gun world is evil, right? Like that's how we make sense of a lot of mass shootings and things like that. We say, oh, they're on this and they're on that. Well, there's a lot of people on that, but I'm on your side on this. I believe that medication should be sort of a last resort. But when you do go that route, I think there needs to be a plan for it. And I think a lot of people don't get the plan. You know what I mean? Like they don't think about the plan. Like, you know, if I was going to take a medication for whatever it is, whatever the symptom is, like I'm not going to go to the bar on the weekends and get hammered like I normally would have, you know, which might be leading to some of the problems that I have in my life.
You're so correct. I mean, it's ridiculous. A person can literally go to their general practitioner at their annual checkup and say, I've been feeling a little blue lately, and they can walk away with a prescription for Prozac, you know, from their general practitioner without that person having any, you know, meaningful training in mental health. And, you know, as you said, without any, you know, necessarily meaningful, accountable follow-up care about if that person is taking the medication correctly. Again, and if there might be other factors that are causing their problems in the first place. But ironically, there's less money behind doing it the right way, because as a psychiatrist or a general practitioner, you can charge, you know, hundreds of dollars for 15-minute appointments. That is, you know, that's a common appointment increment time. And sure, maybe for the first visit, maybe it's 30 minutes or 45 minutes. But then after that, the person could come in for their renewal visit twice a year for 15 minutes each, you know. And again, it's seductive to the public, because I actually believe it's almost like a failure of informed consent to lead a patient to believe that this is just as good and this will be fine and you can do this and it will, quote, you know, work, as opposed to really saying to them, you know, well, let's talk about the fact that you are 100 pounds overweight. First of all, why is that happening? Are there issues leading to that? And how would you feel if you were also not 100 pounds overweight? Like what other, you know, mood effects would that have on you? And so you're right, we do see mass shooters a lot of times, you know, that are on medication. But a lot of times all that means is that more people were throwing cheap fixes at the problem and they weren't actually getting any real help.
Mike's got a story that I want him to share about his daughter taking one of our screenings, but how much do you work on insight? Because I know that the temptation is to throw a solution based on our worldview as practitioners. But oftentimes I've encountered people, I mean, way too often actually, running an agency for the last 9 years with many clinicians. We staff a lot of cases, and it's staggering how many people walk in knowing nothing about how they tick and just seeking relief. And our field, I think, is all too happy to give it to them because it makes us feel good. Like, I helped that person, right? And my bias is that people can help themselves more often than they don't. And honestly, with the Abigail Schreier wrote a book recently called Bad Therapy, and it highlights, and people will quibble at a few things, but the overall picture is that we, as medical and mental health care have expanded, people have gotten sicker. What are we doing wrong, right? And I think that that's part of it. We've just drifted into complacency, trying to solve symptoms rather than solving problems. And I wonder about insight, and I want to have Mike share the story to really frame it. But go ahead, tell that one that you like to tell.
Yeah. So when I first started this, keep in mind I was not into the mental health world at all. Like I understood the importance of mental health, but like I still came from like that old school mentality of like, you know, suck it up, right? Like it's just how my family was. But my daughter had come into my office one day, and I had just started working with Mental Health America on trying to partner to find solutions for negative outcomes of firearms. And I wanted to take the big pharma way out of this. I thought, hey, the gun industry could go raise money, hand it over to mental health. Mental health could like pay for some of the outsource and resources and all the things that they kind of bitched about in many of the papers that I had read with budget cuts and funding. Right? I thought those things were in place, but we just got away from them because the funding got cut back. So when I was struggling to figure out how we were going to be different and how we could, you know, implement resources and stuff like that through the firearm and the firearms industry, I got this idea that came from my daughter, because one thing that Mental Health America has is these free and anonymous mental health screenings where you can go and take one, and basically they have like 12 different categories: anxiety, depression, you know, substance abuse, those type of things. My daughter comes in my office one day and she goes, Dad, I think I suffer from anxiety. Now, I don't think any parent wants to hear something like that, right? Because you just look at your kid and you're kind of like, it's almost a natural reaction. It's like, no, you don't have anxiety. You're fine. Like, stop. You know what I mean? Because you don't want to see them. But it was the first thing
you know how to say, of course you do. Let me teach you how to use it constructively.
All right. Once again, though, this is me back then. All right. But I was able to kind of pivot because I thought, oh my God, like, and I didn't even believe in these screenings, to be honest. When I first saw them, I was like, really, how could a screening help? Like, I kind of doubted it, but I was like, I'm not going to knock it, because I'm sure there's people that, you know, I totally changed my opinion on that. I was way off base. But my daughter says, hey, I think I suffer from anxiety. And I came from the family where they said, I'll give you something to have anxiety about, and you just keep it moving, right? Like that's how we're going to play this. But I said, hey, go, you know, the organization that Daddy's been working with, because, you know, she's 11 years old. She was hanging around my office. She'd do her homework in my office. So she saw me working with Mental Health America and taking these meetings and things like that. I said, go on their website, take a free and anonymous screening. Like it's on there. And at the time, those screenings weren't even linked to Walk to Talk America. They were just a Mental Health America thing. I said, take the one for anxiety. I said, answer it honestly. No one's going to come knocking at your door. Just answer it honestly. Don't lie. Let me know what you think. And I just sent her on her way. And I thought, you know, she's probably never going to do it, whatever. But a couple of days later, she comes back into my office. She hands me the mail on our way out. She's like, hey, Dad, I took the thingy. And I was like, what are you talking about? She said, the thingy. What do you mean? She's like, the thingy for anxiety, the screening. I was like, oh, I'm like, how did that go? And she like looked and she smiled, like huge smile. And she goes, I only have mild anxiety. And I was like, oh, that's a good thing though, right? Like, you feel better? And she's like, no, I feel great. And I said, okay, that's good. I'm happy for you, you know? And she, on her way out, she's like, oh, and I'm going to give this to a few of my friends because I think they need it. And that was a light bulb moment for me. So that was the first program that Walk the Talk America ever really kicked off that really had any teeth with Mental Health America, because I was like, ooh, how do I get this in the hand of gun owners? So I started putting them on these bands. And it's kind of like the Live Strong band, right? But it just says, take a free and anonymous mental health screening. So we were passing these out at gun shows. And man, like, what a conversation starter. But the idea came from my daughter, and watching how her figuring that out through the screening basically altered and changed the way she thought about anxiety, or, you know, because she could have easily been told she has anxiety, and now, you know, now you live it. Now that's you have to identify as somebody. But she found out real quick. And then that idea graduated towards putting the free and anonymous mental health screenings on in the boxes of firearms, right? To let firearms owners be able to take a screening at their leisure in the privacy of their own home, not having to worry about being tracked or things like that, just to see where they're at. The cool thing about that story is we have enough anecdotal stories to know that this has worked for other people, adults, right? Like people that have taken a screening, like Jake can attest to that. And it's just kind of cool. Like going back to what Jake has preached from day one, like, let's give people the skills and the mechanisms and the resources to actually make themselves feel better without like telling them they're these like wounded animals and they're going to be that way the rest of their life. So that's the story with the screenings.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one question, what year was that?
So that was like almost 6 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was before the APA came out with their ridiculous guidelines on toxic masculinity. And I think, unfortunately, that a lot of the people at gun shows, which is, not all men, but I imagine a lot men, I think that they have reason to distrust a free and anonymous mental health screening these days, because I think that the American Psychological Association has really burned its trust, I think, with a lot of, men and gun owners. And I was telling you, I Googled, gun owners and psychology. But aside from that, I just want to say I think it's awesome that you're doing that. Obviously, it's great, to be putting those conversations out there to people, and being able to ask questions. I also do want to validate, though, the part of you that said, it sounds like you don't necessarily have it anymore, but I would actually validate the part of you that had even a little bit of a suspicion around screenings, because the one that you're using, I don't know anything about it. Sounds like it's great. But there are screenings that I think can be leading to people and can almost kind of plant ideas. Like I'm not a fan, of like some of these quote screenings that are asking kids, have you ever felt like you were the opposite gender? Have you ever felt, like these kinds of things? So I actually do think that there's a healthy concern about what exactly is said in screenings, though it sounds like the screening that you're using is great. I wish that what they would also do, of course, is that if a person is rated as having mild anxiety, I wish that they would say, there's actually good ways to use that anxiety. Here's a resource, for how to learn more about that, because even a person with mild anxiety could still walk away from that thinking, well, I'm only a little bit sick. You know what I mean? Without really realizing, that there's actually a really healthy side to that. But either way, I think it's wonderful that you're including that conversation, because there are certainly people, that need to have someone reach out and ask them those questions. So go ahead.
No, I was just say it was really funny because when I first, came up with the idea, I remember having to take these screenings and being like, okay, this is something that could get me like totally kicked out of the gun industry if this fails, right? Or it leads you down a bad path. And I remember like taking the anxiety screening and the depression screening, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to answer this. Like, I'm going to do a normal one. Like, I'm going to answer it honestly. And then I'm going to do one that I'm in a bad way. Right. I was just going to go right to the negative on everything. And because I mean, for me, I had to test like, hey, is this legit? Like, could I potentially be getting a phone call if the answers on this don't look so good? And it turned out okay, but I had to check. And it was a big thing for me not to there's no questions about firearms on there. You know what I mean? And that, I think that's important for firearms owners, because it's like, okay, look, I need to find a baseline. And we preach all the time, like, you don't have to be in crisis to take one of these screenings. Like, if you just want to see where you're at or to see how you answer these things, I don't think it has to always be, oh my God, take a screening. Like, you're on the edge. You know what I mean? Like you got to see where you're at. No, sometimes it's just, hey, like, just see where you might fall on there. Right. Like, there might be something that you learn about yourself.
Yeah, and the nice thing I will say as well about screenings on some level, I think it's a nuanced topic. I don't really have, obviously a black and white opinion, because there's different types of screenings in different types of contexts. But the nice thing about a screening is that hopefully it's not a financially motivated screening, like where it leads directly to, oh, you need therapy, connect with this person. And so, Jake, to your point about Abigail Schreier's wonderful book, Bad Therapy, which I loved, you described it as about, solving symptoms, therapy sometimes is solving symptoms, surface symptoms, rather than addressing the actual problems. another thing I think that she did in that book was to talk about how oftentimes what therapy does as well, the bad therapy, is that it actually seeks to invent problems that
Yep.
are not there. So, Michael, if you, for example, had, instead of giving your daughter this, little screening and helping to normalize for her that, anxiety exists and it's okay, and, she can talk to you about it. If you had just, randomly the wind had blown a different way and you had taken her to a therapist that might have smelled a paycheck. I mean, and I hate to say it, but consciously or unconsciously, I think a lot of therapists will sit down with a child who's perfectly fine. And instead of normalizing for them a certain amount of anxiety and maybe embarking on a short course of skills-based therapy to learn how to use their anxiety constructively, they'll say, "Oh, yeah, so, you were feeling like the world was ending. When have you felt that way before? What's your earliest memory of ever feeling that way? Gee," and the next thing you know, they're spinning this into something. And this is part of what Abigail's book, delves into, is that in many cases they can make it worse. Now, that said, Jake, I do agree that it is important to look at the insight around the problems. Sometimes it actually is just helpful to address the symptoms, right? Sometimes it actually is, in many cases. But in other cases, we need to look behind it. So, suppose the patient comes because, they're in a toxic relationship. On some level, yes, just learning to disengage from that person, learn how to reject their calls, and learn how to truly just turn it off. That's helpful. But then sometimes it's also helpful to look into that family history, self-esteem, attention-seeking behaviors. There's always, I guess what I'm saying is that I don't think that there's no rubric, which is why I don't think we'll ever really have AI therapy, because there is something about the human element that we just can't replace.
You're speaking to the depth of a human that I think often gets overlooked with all the behavioral therapies. And behavioral therapies are great for changing patterns and creating insight and all that. But if somebody's got an existential issue, CBT ain't going to help it. You need to get into the depth of humanity and what the core of the individual really wants to do in life, right? And I think too that when you laid out that anecdote, that hypothetical of the therapist who's doing a little too much digging, I actually had a grad student some time ago when I said, so she brings in this case about a child who is of some younger age, under 10, I think. And parents presented with the typical problem: they can't sit still in school, and no fights, just distraction, all that stuff. And I said, sounds like childhood. And the student was like, and no children in this student's home, by the way. So it was a different conversation. I said, yeah, this sounds like childhood. This sounds like normal development. I don't think we need to pathologize it. And I kid you not, she goes, well, isn't that malpractice if I turn him away? And I was like, no, actually that's beneficence. And that's what grad school is teaching these people. Apparently these students are coming out thinking that simply by nature of someone presenting in the office, they are therefore ill and must have a diagnosis. And the diagnostic thing is an issue too, because we're not allowed to send a claim to insurance that doesn't have a diagnosis attached. There still is no preventative care in our world paid for by insurance. So that's a rub as well. It's like, oh, you want to receive a, pop the hood, check the belts and hoses session where I give you some skills and you're like, oh, cool, I feel so much better. That's totally going to work in my life. I literally address the symptoms because they're not problematic. They're just inconvenient. I go, yeah, okay. I forgot. Yeah, I should get back to the gym or whatever. I have to diagnose the person with an illness.
You're right.
That's nuts. And along with that comes a treatment plan, because that's required by law and all the things. And it's like, one session, man. I just did one session. I can't unethically diagnose something that doesn't meet criteria, but I'd like to be compensated for my time. How do we work within that? So we're flirting with moral injury here just by nature of the system in which we are operating, not to say nothing of the education and training that is prejudicially tilting us toward seeking out illnesses simply so we can engage in care. It's nutty.
Yeah,
I have a question. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I have a question
all.
for both of you, because this is like the perfect time. Having said that, Jake, because I always wonder, especially for gun people, like because we're so conditioned to be like afraid of therapists and the things that you could lose your rights. But in a perfect world, wouldn't it be great if you could have insurance pay for like 3 different visits, like consultations, right? Because like, how do you find the perfect therapist, or how do you find the one that's right for you? I feel like most people don't even know. They
That's
call
the
like
other
a
issue.
right, like, and that's
Yeah,
the toughest part.
and that's one of the tropes that gets trotted out in our world too. And I want Chloe to answer this too. But for me, the frustration is you can't swing a cat in a conference and not hit somebody who believes that in order to find the right fit, you should just try several therapists. Like, it doesn't work that way. First of all, there's financial barriers, even if you're cash paying and it's like sort of, under the table or whatever, and we don't really have to create a record. Although in Nevada, we are compelled to create a record, so you have to document every person you ever contact. That it simply doesn't work that way. Every therapist you see, if you try out 3 of them or whatever on Psychology Today, they all have to do what I described, which is if they want to get paid in their bill and insurance, they're sending off a claim. And if you're in Nevada, they're going to have a document that says they at least met with you. So yeah, what are your thoughts?
Right, but I maybe I'm missing, and maybe we may just even disagree, but I actually do encourage people just to speak to a few different therapists before, committing to someone. And I understand to me, it's a best practices, way to do it. And I understand it's not
Yep.
feasible necessarily for everyone to do that. But I guess I would be one of those people that the cat you're swinging at the conference might hit. That I personally think it's helpful, like for an uneducated layperson who's just going to go open up to a therapist and let that therapist, as you said, diagnose them, because that's what the therapist either has to do or believes is true, and offer them a treatment trajectory or not, as some therapists don't really even do that very well. And then the trusting patient who's in a vulnerable state, if they don't shop around and say, oh, well, gee, I also saw this other therapist who looked at my issue totally differently, and I have a choice about, how I can go about this. And, that one therapist wanted to keep attributing everything to my childhood, whereas this therapist is, looking at it from a strengths-based perspective. And, I mean, not that you can't do both, but I think you see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Were you saying, Jake, that you discourage people from seeing a few different therapists in the early phases
No.
potentially?
No.
Okay, I
And I think
misunderstood you.
I
Sorry.
think that's a great idea. I'm saying
Okay.
it's impractical because if we get somebody who had a bad experience up the road at some other clinic and they're using their insurance, my claim for the intake will be rejected because insurance only pays one time a year, sometimes twice a year, for 90791 CPT code, which is the intake interview. It's the assessment and diagnostic thing. So if they've already been assessed and diagnosed, their insurance will reject my claim. And if they go to me and I get rejected and they don't like me either, then they go to the third one, that one will also get rejected. So now you got 2 practitioners who won't get reimbursed. That's the insurance game. That's what I was lamenting.
See. Got it. Sorry. Yeah. And thank you for clarifying. I misunderstood that. And I just
And the
wanted to
member
say,
with the insurance doesn't know either. They
I'm
don't know
sorry?
until the member with the insurance doesn't know either until they get the
Yeah.
bill.
Oh, they're the worst. I know. I have a professional biller, and even with her, she's like, "Look, there are certain things we just won't know until we file a claim." Um, but to your point, Jake, I think it's a really good one about clinicians if in certain situations, depending on their business model, that they have to diagnose an illness in order to, have a session with somebody. And then there's something called cognitive dissonance. And I don't want to get too deep into nerd talk here, but cognitive dissonance is a very misunderstood psychology term. But what it really means is when we adapt our thinking, our cognition, to fit our behavior. So if there's a gap between my behavior and my thinking, I will, generally speaking, adapt my thinking to fit my behavior. So,
Correct.
if I constantly go to a taco restaurant just because it's the only one nearby, I will actually begin to interpret that behavior and cognitively start thinking I like tacos. And so for a clinician, that has to diagnose people with mental illness all the time. And Jake, you're a very strong-minded person, which is great. So you're able to be conscious and understand what you're doing and why, and you talk about it, which is great. It helps you to remain conscious of it. But a therapist who's not talking about it, conscious of it, and strong-minded can fall prey to that cognitive dissonance, where because they're constantly diagnosing everybody that they meet, they can start actually coming to believe it and really kind of actually buying in and labeling these people with these diagnoses, in this, messed up system. So I'm just so glad that you're talking about that.
Sorry for clearing my throat into the open mic. Thanks for highlighting that. Do you think that that's an example of groupthink?
Well, what I just described is actually the cognitive dissonance part is just something that occurs on an individual level. But when all of the therapists start doing it together, I suppose, like they're meeting at a conference and they're all talking about how they diagnose people in the initial session and then making the initial session diagnosis, then you could develop a groupthink process where the part of you that says, but wait a minute, does it really make sense to do that? That part of you could be subsumed into the groupthink of the group.
I think that's what I'm angling at with the idea that it becomes heretical to challenge the notion because so many people just accept it as the way it is. It becomes an introjected belief among the clinical community. And within my agency, I say, don't hold too tightly to the initial. The initial diagnosis can be a diagnostic impression, and then it can and should change over time as symptoms ameliorate or present or whatnot. And so we want to be very diligent about changing the diagnosis and the treatment plan. It's hard work. Like, it should be hard work. I don't think we see a lot of good hard work. I think we see a lot of laziness because it's hard, and we see a lot of people, and in our heart of hearts, we want to help people. It
Because
is.
you're doing all that to make it fit into what? The DSM, like which is what? It's not even like the
Imperfect,
DSM
for sure.
is truly created out of truly objective scientific standards. You're fitting it all to create some, kind of subjective system of frankly nonsense sometimes. So, that's why I think it's harder and harder to get good quality providers that are willing to be in the managed care insurance system. So cheers to you for doing God's work on that. But I know we got to wrap up soon. So shall I try to just quickly walk you through the study I mentioned?
Yes, we should.
All right. This is going to be quick, and I just want to share with your audience. I literally just pulled this up 5 or 10 minutes before, more like 5 minutes before we logged on. So I've not done a deep dive into this. I just wanted to share some of just kind of my initial glances at some of this, work about gun owners, because coming from many, psychology research labs, I can tell you they are extremely left-leaning. I think even statistically, if you were to look up the percentage of psychologists, because it is, oftentimes psychologists that are doing this research, in order to get grant funding and things like that in mental health areas, you often have to have a PhD psychologist, leading your team. And I just think it's very interesting that that nobody talks about the fact that these people are extremely statistically likely to be leftists and to have to be affiliated with a political agenda that has some strong feelings about gun control. So with that said, I'm just going to share with you. So this is what I did. I went to Google Scholar. I just did gun ownership and mental health. And this was one of the first studies, from Science Direct here that I looked at. And very interesting here, you'll see one of the highlights, the first highlight: in-home firearm access is detrimental to mental health among children of gun owners. Wow, right? That's a really big claim to just make right there, right? So I was just, okay, well, exactly how exactly, did they do this? So it says that they did a longitudinal study. Okay, well, that sounds good, like they're following people and really studying them closely. But then when we really look at what they actually did, a restricted version of ad health. Okay, school-based longitudinal, beginning with an in-school questionnaire. Okay, and then they did some home interviews and things like that. But one of the things that I noticed that is not addressed in here, and again, there's I'm sure more information, that you could get and dig into this. But what I find very interesting that they didn't even address. Okay, so that they said American adolescents are more likely to have access to firearms, etc. And but what they don't discuss here, which I think is very interesting, at least as far as what I can see, even in the overview. It's very interesting that and I'm going to stop sharing here for a moment because I'm just going to talk about what was not on that screen. And in a fair amount of overview data, they, at least from what I could see, when they go and make this claim that gun ownership is detrimental to the children of gun owners, I didn't see anything on there about this questionnaire about whether or not the gun ownership was legal, right? So children of parents who are owning illegal guns could be a very different situation. Moreover, they didn't, at least from what I could tell, factor in if these were single parent households or if these were step parent households, because children in step parent households are much more likely, to be abused. They also didn't even look into whether or not these guns, at least from what I could tell from that rather extensive overview, I would think that these would be kind of like the very simple things that they would define about, guns in the home, like what conditions are under which are the guns in the home. They also didn't even indicate if these guns belong to kids, right? For all we know, this is like, and where was the study done? I mean, if you were to do a study, say, in the city of Chicago, right? I then became curious about guns. I'm going to share my screen again. And how many guns are legal, versus illegal. And so again, I had only literally about 5 minutes here to pull up all these tabs. This was just super quick, but it says about 7 million guns sold in the US, and then some estimate that 1 million are illegal, right? So I mean, again, this is just super quick. I don't know, but the idea that they're not even talking about this data, but what I just showed you suggests that it's close to 20% of guns that would be illegal in the first place, and so they're not looking at are the guns owned by parents who own them legally? Are they eliminating kids whose parents have a criminal history and have a gun in the home? But they just do this very simple thing, which of course I'm sure in the sample of homes in which there are guns, there could be a lot of mental illness if you include all of those pathological or other family dynamic situations I described. But it doesn't look like they even gave a nod to saying we eliminated this type of data, right? So that was just like a super quick thing of taking a very, very, very quick glance at the gun literature, because the reason I did it is because Jake had texted me something on a Twitter conversation about how there was, just very little high quality research that felt unbiased about guns. And so I was like, yeah, I'm not surprised to hear that given what I know about my field. And so I just did that really quick search and went with you.
In a academic parlance, would we say that they failed to control for confounding variables? Is that
Yeah,
how we say that?
potentially. And again, I didn't look deep into
And we
the
don't know,
study,
right?
but I would think that they would absolutely trumpet that. They would say even excluding, illegal guns, situations where the guns are owned by the kids themselves, situations in which, the parent has a criminal history. I would think that they would want to make that very clear, but I didn't see that even considered, at least in the somewhat extensive overview on page 1 where they make the big claim.
Yeah, this is exactly why. So Jake and I, for the last couple of years, have been trying to build this directory of clinicians who are culturally competent in firearms, right? It's not even necessarily Pro 2A, although most likely if you're going to put your name on it, you're going to be, Pro 2A. But we don't necessarily believe you have to be like a rah 2A person to understand gun culture and understand. But gun owners are so hesitant to come forward because of that type of garbage. You know what I mean? It's just like telling people that guns are bad, guns are normal, guns are killers. And that's an issue. And that's one of the reasons why we're afraid of therapists, right? But that leads to hitting stage 4, as opposed to I could have gone at stage 1 when I wasn't feeling so good and talked to somebody. And this is why we got to change that.
And there's one other thing I wanted to show you guys too. I was curious if this is actually true, because like I said, I don't necessarily know a lot about this topic. But in my just kind of super quick Google search, I found this, which said, under a federal law, it is unlawful for any person to basically sell or dispose of firearm or ammunition to any person, knowing or having reasonable cause to believe that such person has been adjudicated as a mental defective, which is of course different from just having a mental illness. But here's the part that really caught my eye: or has been committed to any mental institution. I mean, wow. I've never been in a mental institution myself, but I have worked with clients, and I only work with people that are at a higher level of functioning. But I've worked with people that were at a higher level of functioning who 20 years ago, they, were committed for a brief period of time and they kind of got themselves together or whatever. But is that true then, that like if you're a 50-year-old person and you were committed for a week when you were 21, that you're forever disqualified by that federal law?
It's interesting you bring this up. We have 2 excellent podcasts, well, 3, 4, because we've interviewed them twice each, Sandy Richardson and Isaac Ritchie, who are battling that exact thing and the terminology behind it and what constitutes a commitment versus a voluntary engagement in counseling. Mike, you know the 4473 form better than a lot of people. You should probably comment.
Yeah, I mean, it is true. And most people don't even understand what they're filling out they don't even know what that means. I mean, I hate to say it, but most people, when you say like mentally adjudicated, right? Like
we lack definitional value.
Yeah.
Eyes glaze over. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just, and it's crazy because we've had, there's a lot of anecdotal stories because a lot of people don't want to go on record to talk about this stuff on a podcast, right? But you get your Sandy Richardsons that are like, hey, you messed with the wrong person. Like, this is bullshit, right? But a lot of people will call and say, hey, I was 21 years old. I'm now 30. I didn't do anything to anybody. I was cutting myself because I thought the world ended because my girlfriend and I broke up. I checked myself in. I did the right thing before it escalated to something, more horrific. And now I've lost my gun rights. Like, no one.
It also allows people to weaponize that, right? Like, I've heard of some nasty cases where, like, divorce is going on, ex-wife wants to mess with him, they're having a custody battle, so she says that he said this, and then he has to go spend 24 hours in a such and such facility, and then his guns are taken away. And I mean, it weaponized, so to speak. It just sounds like there's so much there. I'm really glad that you guys are digging in and talking about it.
Well, and I'll tell you that to tell you that, like, I have a very good working relationship with the mother of my children now. Like, we're fine. We're fine. We went through a very ugly divorce. She has suffered from her own mental health issues, but these are things that we talk about. And it's funny when you put the guns down, you stop fighting, and you realize the kids are the most important thing. Because there's no doubt if a red flag law existed when we were getting divorced back in 2012 in the state of Nevada, right? Like, she would have found a way to red flag me. She would have gone through, it's just because there was so many things that her lawyer and their strategy was, let's just throw this against the wall, see what sticks, and keep him on his toes, right? And, now that we have this relationship, and I would ask her, hey, you married me. We were married for 12 years. Like, the things you were saying, like, where did you come up with those? And she admitted it. She goes, my lawyer told me this is what we're going to do. And she's like, I regret listening to them. I wish I wouldn't have. I wish I would have made my own decisions. Right. But she had outside influences. And so I always tell people, that's a person that I'm cool with now. You know what I mean? That's admitted to me that there was people that took the reins and said, this is the strategy. This is the plan. Right. So how many people does that happen to that don't have the means to, you know, I was lucky. I was successful. I had good lawyers. You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of people that don't have good lawyers. And then all of a sudden it's just like, you're taking away something that's so valuable to them, like say their ability to defend themselves or just their how they feel about
I've
rights.
heard of it happening to women too, women that are the victims of domestic abuse, that their abuser figures out ways to red flag them, and then the woman is defenseless, you know. I mean, again, I don't claim to have all the answers, you know. Obviously we don't want, you know, certain types of mentally ill people, or, you know, even mentally well people who don't know how to handle themselves and they're hotheads. And there are people who shouldn't have guns who don't realize it. And society needs to have a mechanism to address that. But on the other hand, yeah, it's frightening when that can become weaponized, you know, and manipulated.
Yeah, the unintentional consequences of some of these things that people don't think about that scare, because it'd take you 2 seconds to jump into our world and understand everything we're doing if you just did like a 2-hour deep dive, because I think we're all speaking the same language and you understand how the importance of freedom and also like accountability and things like that. But it really is, it's a blind spot that we have in society when it comes to firearms, and people don't realize that they're really making it worse. And it's really, I'm lucky enough to be able to run in circles to where sometimes I'm able to make people see those blind spots just by having this like nuanced conversation where I'm not judging people, because most people don't want guns in their well, everybody usually doesn't want guns in the hands of the wrong people, right? But for the most part, people don't want to see people die. And unfortunately, they don't understand that like red flag laws and things like that scare the hell out of gun owners. And people don't understand how important the Second Amendment is to some people. Some people will not even remotely vote for somebody if they're not pro 2A, right? Like, that's how strong they feel about the second. That's the hill they're going to die on, right? Where some people it's abortion, right? Some people it's this. So it's like, but people have to understand that it doesn't do us any good to have unhealthy gun owners. And suicide is the main issue when it comes to firearm deaths and negative outcomes. Like, that's the main one. But it doesn't do us any favors as a society to have a bunch of gun owners who are like, I can't talk to people. I can't
I
talk
have
to
to
anyone.
say though, it really bothers me when people talk about guns as the driver behind suicide rates. Okay, because yes, you know, guns are a popular, you know, tool for suicide, but we've had very high rates of gun ownership in our country before without any issues of suicide, you know, or with suicide being very rare. So if suicide is on the rise, I don't think that it's directly linked to some kind of a rise in gun ownership. And so to pin it on gun ownership, I think is not only unfair, you know, to gun owners, but it's also doing a disservice to the hurting people who are committing suicide to say, well, the problem is the gun. No, it's not. I think that there's some other reason driving those suicide
Yeah.
rates.
What you'll see too is, and I've seen these graphs where they try to track a correlation between the rise in firearms ownership, which has risen, and the rise in suicide, and let the public project onto it the implied meaning. But that's not it, right? The angle now for the gun control crowd is to call guns, which is what they are. They are the most lethal means by which you can attempt suicide. They're very, very effective, as opposed to any other method by which you would attempt suicide. And so they're saying they're the most lethal means, therefore they must be controlled the most. And we take the approach that they should be controlled personally, not by .gov. You should create time and space between you and your firearm. If you get into a situation where you shouldn't be around them, okay, fine. But to put a little finer point on this, and I'm going to give a hat tip to Clovertack, who's in the chat on YouTube. I assume it's YouTube right now. because he's a really good friend of ours and speaks very logically about this as well. Very big pro 2A guy. And he says, how about instead of saying shouldn't have guns, we should turn that around and say should be healthy, happy, and civil people contributing to society. And I agree 100% with that, because to define the adjudication, by the way, adjudicated mentally defective is when a judge says you're mentally defective, go to the institution. Committed to means an involuntary commitment. And that's where we get really wrapped around the axle of, well, what's involuntary versus voluntary? Because at any point in time, a person can self-discharge from an institution if they're all there voluntarily. Even the quote unquote mandatory programs for alternative sentencing is voluntary, because you got a choice. You can go to prison or you can go to treatment. But it's all voluntary. Very, very, very rarely is somebody involuntarily committed that would hit that on the 4473. But the fact is, the public doesn't know. And then you get an instance where, like, Isaac Ritchie voluntarily put himself into treatment while he was in the Army, completed care, got well, discharged, and several years later found himself on a list not being able to buy guns because someone somewhere in the bowels of the bureaucracy in the state of New York decided that that was an involuntary admission. And now the poor guy can't get a job as a cop like he wanted to. So he's one of the ones fighting this. And if we could ever get to the point where we say, look, mental illness is like physical illness, it can and should be overcome, except for vanishingly rare circumstances. And those people are usually in a group home. They're struggling with something they're never going to overcome. Guns aren't even on their radar. We have to start talking about health, not illness. We have to start talking about the potential outcomes of successful care. And then, just like the prison system, if the Department of Corrections is actually doing correcting, we have to believe that once corrected, once mentally well, all your rights are restored. There is no looking back in time and pretending that once ill, always ill, because that makes no sense. It flies in the face of our entire profession, and we would cease to exist if that were the case. Like, nobody could change. So I really hope that, we're starting to dig into the actual definitional value of these terms, educating people on them, and getting a more collaborative conversation to say, look, if you're repelling people from care, that's problematic. And as we all know, the suicide rate has not gone down in spite of all these intrusive intervention strategies and policies. It's just not working.
Sure. I would just say, when I say people who shouldn't have guns, you could even add, like, right now, you know what I mean?
Oh, we're all
Like,
guilty of it. Yeah. Temporarily.
well, but hey, I mean, I don't know, honestly. I haven't thought about it super deeply. As a clinical psychologist, I certainly have actually evaluated people that actually do have conditions that are not expected to change. And as you said, Jake,
Right.
they often are. It's not even just all people who live in group homes. I'm sure there are plenty of people who live in group homes who could be very responsible gun owners. But there are just people who have certain limitations that are just not expected to be functioning ever at a level, maybe where gun ownership would be advisable. I don't know. Like I said, I haven't thought super deeply about that, because I'm not a gun expert psychologist, for sure. But I would also, because I'm always skeptical of data that's presented in certain ways. I would be curious, when you say, like, oh, well, there's this data that shows an increase in gun ownership and a correlative increase in suicide. I would be curious, well, exactly how many decades back did they go? Because, I mean, in the 1800s, did they look at the fact that, like, school kids used to bring their rifle to school?
Oh, it wasn't the 1800s. It was like the 1970s. Like,
Okay,
this is an ancient history.
So that's a very interesting time. I would expect that no matter what, suicidality was increasing in the 1970s. I mean, we had all kinds of social, problems, and the economy issues, and all kinds of social problems. And so if you start the graph in 1970, oh, well, oh my goodness, look at that, rate. And then I would also be curious, are they looking at just the raw numbers of guns? Because
Yes,
of course,
always.
as the population increases, the raw number of blenders in your home and vacuums are going to increase as well. But are they looking at the actual statistical rate of gun ownership in the society? And again, beginning the chart in 1970, I would be really skeptical of that.
Yeah, and the whole like single causality thing is just drives me batty. They forget about the multivariate contributions of multiple things in the home. You know, like that the latest thing about the gas stoves and autism or whatever. It's like, like
They better
okay,
not
because you
come for
want to
that.
control. Yeah, you want to control gas stoves. I see what you're doing here. I feel like Happy Gilmore. Like I know what you're doing, and I don't like it. Um, well, I think we've gone on long enough ranting and raving. So, Mike, yeah, I got one more thing there.
Yeah, I just want to ask you the question that we ask everybody on the way out. How do you tend to your mental health?
Okay, well, I want to say thank you as well. You know, Jake and Michael, this has been truly a great conversation. I agree, it's probably a good wrap up time, but it's really been a good conversation, and I want to thank the people too in the chat that shared and were in the conversation. It's really cool what you guys have going here with this show. As far as I take care of my own mental health, I mean, it's going to sound very cheesy, but I live on a trail and I go for walks. So I always encourage people. There's this like really multitasking, easy way to get a triple whammy dose of mental health. So you go on a walk in nature on a cell phone catch-up call with a friend. So then you're getting three things that are really good for your mental health all at the same time. You know, you're getting that exercise, you're outside, you're in nature, and you're getting social support. I go to church. I love to cook. I spend time with my family. You know, honestly, ever since I left New York and started doing free speech, oh my gosh, I think free speech is so good for mental health. I've been much more just happy since I made that move.
That was an excellent answer. How can people find you?
Yeah, so they can go to makeachange.us. It'll take you to the same place that's showing here under my name, which is drchloe.com/independent. But I know there's a lot of pitfalls there of spelling because Dr. Chloe can be hard to spell sometimes. So if you just go to makeachange.us, it'll take you to the same place.
And the book.
Yeah, thanks so much for noticing the book again. I see Clover Tech. You know, I don't yet. I've got very small weak hands, and so I'm actually looking at trying to get one of those like little pistols, like an old-fashioned revolver. But yeah, I'm not against it. I'm not there yet. Personally, I don't have the skills.
You have so much to learn about the firearms community, and I'm excited to watch this journey progress because if you're anything like me, once you get exposed to it, it's like I don't have any tattoos, but apparently once you get your first tattoo, you can't stop. And I think the Mike holds his arms on the camera. It's like once you really start finding out what the culture's about, it's like, oh man, there's so much you can do with this stuff. It's pretty cool. So, and Clever Tech's question for those who can't see it is, he says, so Chloe must carry a 44 mag revolver just in case she runs across a bear, right? I don't know how many bears there are in Florida. I think they have panthers, Florida panthers, right?
Yeah.
Manta rays.
Well, thanks, guys.
Thanks. Yeah, appreciate your time. And on behalf of our entire Walk the Talk America family, we wish you all great mental wellness. Bye-bye.